it should work. Fantastic. Let me just double check that we're actually streaming. And we are. Fantastic. Okay. Now, welcome to the first CNS talk of 2024. Quite exciting to have our first talk. And I'm very excited today because we have Professor Gregory Hickock with us, who I had the pleasure of meeting before. And obviously his work is familiar to everyone in this room, as far as I know, and also to most people waiting on Zoom. Sorry, on YouTube. We're on Zoom. Too many worlds in parallel. Professor Hickock is a cognitive neuroscientist, and he integrates behavioral neuroimaging and computational approaches to study the functional anatomy and the computational architecture of language, and quite famous for the dual stream model that we've been discussing a lot in this group, at least. He has a background in psychology, PhD-wise, and spent postdoctoral time at MIT and the Salk Institute. Is that how you pronounce it? Mm-hmm. Yes. Yep. Right. And then joined UC Irvine in California in 1996, where hi Anna, where he became the founding director of the Center of Cognitive Neuroscience and the founder of the Center for Language Sciences, and is a distinguished professor and chair of language sciences and cognitive sciences. Makes sense if you're the founding director of both. And also, amazingly, that's quite an honor. Was it last year, the election to Fellow of the American Association of the Advancement of Science? Congratulations. And a final achievement that I want to throw into the room before I hand over to Gregory himself is that he was also the first elected chair of the Society for the Neurobiology of Language, SNL. Now, without further ado, I happily hand over to you, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thanks for the invite, Steph. Thanks everyone for joining. I'm going to be, let me share my screen. Let's see. You see it okay? Okay, very good. So I'm going to be talking about an elaboration, essentially, of the dual stream model in terms of what's going on at a slightly finer grained, with a slightly finer grained picture into the dorsal stream in particular. So let me acknowledge my collaborators on this project, John Venezia and Alex Tegipko, both former students of mine, but contributed quite a bit to this project. So let me just start at the beginning. In the beginning, there was, of course, Broca's area, which Broca believed was the faculty that coordinates the proper movement of articulated language. So he had a very particular view of what was going on in the area that is his namesake region. He didn't think he had localized language necessarily. He didn't think he had localized motor control for speech. It was the in-between zone that coordinated the proper movement of articulated language. About 100 years later, Norm Geschwin, famous neurologist, concurred with Broca's. Excuse me, still kind of early for me today. Geschwin wrote, Broca's area, which is adjacent to the region of the motor cortex that controls the movement of the muscles of the lips, the jaw, the tongue, the soft palate, and the vocal cords, apparently incorporates programs for the coordination of these muscles in speech, so a speech coordination problem. We know better today, though. Broca's area is not doing speech coordination. I think there's general agreement on that, at least at this kind of lower intermediate level. And a bunch of different functions have been proposed for Broca's area, including cognitive control, lexical selection, aspects of syntax, sequencing, and so on, which leaves open the question of where is this faculty of articulate speech? Well, it seems that there are two, and that's what I'm going to be arguing today. Both are on the precentral gyrus. One is posterior to Broca's area, kind of in the region of the ventral, inferior frontal gyrus and posterior zone, that hierarchy. So one is kind of situated where we might expect it to be. One is more dorsal, if on Broca's brain, somewhere up in this zone here. So I'm going to talk briefly about the evidence that motivates the existence of two speech coordination areas. And just to preview, I'm going to argue that there are these two speech coordinations on the precentral gyrus, but they are themselves part of two separable hierarchies of speech planning. One in the traditional ventral hierarchy, and one a bit more dorsal. So I'm going to talk about fMRI, direct cortical stimulation, apraxia of speech, and a study of connectome mapping of repetition and aphasia to motivate these two zones. So this more dorsal zone was showing up in data ever since functional MRI was invented, pretty much, and when back in the 90s. It was showing up in my own data. So these are all tasks, images from tasks that involve both listening to and speaking in various ways, listening to speech and speaking. And in these early studies, we would always see something that looked kind of like Broca's area, which didn't surprise us. And we're like, oh yeah, Broca's area is involved in speech production, also activates during listening in most studies. But there was this dorsal zone that was quite strong. This is an early study from Kathy Price's group. This is some of my early work mapping the SPT circuit. Here's SPT. You can see the area. I was obsessed with that at the time. But we were seeing these two frontal areas activating during both listening to and covert repetition of speech. This is Stephen Wilson's famous study that was part of the mirror neuron craze back in the day, showing regions associated with listening to and producing syllables. So it was showing up in the functional imaging data from the early days. I didn't think all that much of it other than to make note of it when I drew the dual stream model architecture. So you have the traditional ventral zone showing up here, but this is a nod to the fact that that more dorsal area seemed to activate during speech tasks. I didn't know what it was, but I drew it and made some arrows. So this talk is going to be about trying to understand what that zone is doing. Recently, there was a large-scale study of direct cortical stimulation mapping during speech arrest was published. This is a multi-site study. Here's 917 different sites that elicited speech arrest. You can see a lot of them are kind of focused on the posterior frontal lobe. If you do a density map, it kind of looks like this, where the focus is not in Broca's area. This is Broca's area here. It's on the precentral gyrus, but you can see that it extends up into a bunch of different zones. These authors did a cluster analysis to see if there are separable clusters, spatial clusters in this region here, that distribution of areas that produce speech arrest, and they identified 4. These are the 2 that we're going to focus on. So a ventral one and a dorsal one. They noted that the peak of speech arrest was not in classic Broca's area. So again, arguing that Broca's area is doing something higher level. And speech arrest, by the way, is thought to that in order to count as a speech arrest site, you have to get speech arrest in the absence of any kind of frank motor signs. So you can't get any twitching in muscles anywhere in order to count as speech arrest. So something slightly higher level is typically what's thought to be disrupted. So I said that. And this is just to show that if you map a different type of disruption, that is anomia, you get a different distribution that now includes Broca's area. So again, arguing for something higher level going on. Anomia here is defined as a difficulty in producing the name for a picture in the context of a carrier phrase. So you get a picture of something, and the task is to say, this is a, and then you produce the word. It counts as anomia if it does not interrupt the carrier phrase. So the individuals can say, this is a, but then they either fail to come up with the word, or they just make an error on it or something like that. You can see it's a different distribution. So again, not a speech coordination area when we're talking about Broca's area. Now, if we want to look to a a syndrome that seems to be a reflection of damage to a speech coordination system as opposed to something higher or lower level. Apraxia of speech kind of fits that bill quite well. It's typically thought of literally as a speech coordination deficit or a speech motor planning problem, not a low-level dysarthria. I'm not going to jump into the details of apraxia of speech. It does have a controversial neuroanatomy, but the point I want to make is that both ventral and dorsal premotor areas have been implicated. So this is an example from one study that I was involved in, looking at apraxia of speech in acute stroke. R.G. Hillis was my main collaborator on this work. And what you can see is this is showing acute interruption of blood flow, as well as including acute frank lesions. You can see that Broca's area isn't particularly implicated in apraxia of speech, but you do see regions up and down the precentral gyrus being implicated. Higher level tasks like digit span does implicate Broca's area, as you can see. So both dorsal and ventral regions, as well as other areas on the somatosensory side, are implicated in apraxia of speech. Interestingly, recent work on apraxia of speech has suggested two possible subtypes of this syndrome, a prosodic and a phonetic subtype, which suggests maybe multiple sources of apraxia of speech. And you'll see how this fits in to the thinking here shortly. So turning now to the connectome of speech. The classic view, of course, is that the two main language areas are connected by a single fiber bundle known as the arcuate fasciculus. As you all know, it's a much more complicated picture. This is just a summary diagram from Eddie Chang summarizing the various white matter pathways implicated in language, targeting, as information for neurosurgeons here. But the point is that it's much more complicated. The function of these various pathways has been investigated in various ways, as you know. I had a student who took an approach that was very data-driven, and we had a fairly large data set of patients with aphasia. We thought looking at repetition would be a good way to look at the pathways that were implicated in dorsal stream function. So essentially what my student did is look at DTI data and defined, using an atlas, defined all possible connections between regions. So basically took a big connectome map of a whole bunch of features and then asked the question, which connections best predict an out of sample kind of prediction-based analysis, best predict repetition deficits in stroke aphasia. And what came out of this is a few different connections, which when I first saw this map, I was interested in the fact that there was no obvious kind of arcuate fasciculus-like connection going from classical Wernicke's area to classical Broca's area. Instead, there were a few local connections in the posterior parietal lobe, but and two interesting patterns of connections, one from auditory related areas to a more dorsal region, and one from probably higher level somatosensory regions to a more ventral region in the frontal lobe. So you end up getting, again, these two different regions in the precentral zone being implicated in speech production, in this case, repetition. And this was some of the first clues that there's some difference in connectivity, where the dorsal one is more connected to auditory regions and the ventral one is more connected to somatosensory regions. So interim summary, there seem to be two motor speech coordination areas, the kind of level that Broca was originally targeting. Neither one are Broca's area, however. So the question is, what are they doing? What are the differences between these zones? And there have been some important recent clues to this, and I'm going to talk about two of them, focusing on the dorsal zone, because that's the kind of newer region being implicated in speech processing. And so we want to know what it's doing and contrast it with what's happening in the ventral zone. So just to preview, one of these sources of evidence is that the dorsal, but not the ventral precentral speech area, as I'm going to start calling these zones, is involved in controlling voice pitch during speaking and singing. And it also codes pitch-related acoustic features during speech listening. So it's very auditory related to pitch. That's the upshot. So here's the data. This is work from Eddie Cheng's lab, intracranial recordings. While patients are doing a pitch accent task. So they're just reading a single carrier sentence and putting a pitch accent on different words, like I never said she stole my money. I never said she stole my money. I never said she stole my money, and so on. While they're recording from sites using ECOG in this case, using grids, they asked the question, what regions in the brain showed an increase in activity correlated with pitch height during speech production? And the region that showed this was the what they're calling dorsal laryngeal motor cortex, but that's it's part of that complex, but it's a higher level region, as we'll see shortly. So this dorsal premotor cortex or precentral gyrus region activity in this zone correlates with pitch height during speech production. Now they're showing it on a right hemisphere here, and this effect was seen in both left and right hemispheres, but definitely also left. This is just showing high gamma activity correlated with pitch height in this case. And you can see it in the traces. This is the high gamma activity traces. You can see it higher here, higher on this word, higher on this word, and so on. This region also responds during listening as well. So if you just play back the individual speech, you can also see activity in this zone, which is what we saw in our studies of the SPT circuit, for example, also activates to listening as well as covert speech production. They also tried singing. So it's not a speech thing per se. Singing also produces correlated activity with pitch height in this zone. Interestingly, if you stimulate this region, not only can you elicit speech arrest with stimulation of some subregions, but if you get the right spot, you can also elicit involuntary vocalization, so like the production of a vowel, which is not true of more ventral areas. So they tried looking in more ventral areas and did not observe, in their words, any instances where stimulating the ventral region elicited vocalization. So there's something different about that dorsal zone. Okay, so that's the intracranial work. Next, I want to mention that we've seen quite impressive auditory receptive field properties in this same zone. So this is work from another of my students, John Venezia, who I mentioned earlier, who was interested in mapping auditory cortex. He was interested in coming up with ways to map spectrotemporal receptive fields during speech listening in the temporal lobe, and was successful in doing so. He essentially developed a method that filters out various regions of the spectral of the speech spectrum, and you can use that to map its response properties to different spectral and temporal modulation rates. So the different colors correspond to the how reliable you can map spectrotemporal receptive fields. When we first did this study, we were able to identify lots of auditory areas that did this. That was not surprising, but we also saw a pretty strong region in the precentral gyrus that showed reliable spectrotemporal field response properties. This is kind of what the maps, the spectrotemporal receptive fields look like in various regions. So I just want to emphasize that the spectrotemporal receptive field in this zone here includes sensitivity to regions that code pitch related information. This zone here, the low spectral, low temporal modulation rates correspond to intelligible speech, and we see that all over higher level auditory related areas. So pretty much just this pattern, like kind of like this. In primary auditory cortex, we see sensitivity to a broader range of acoustic features, which isn't surprising. What was surprising is that we saw that broader range of sensitivity to acoustic features in this premotor cortex region. This map that we see here looks a lot like what we see in primary auditory cortex. So kind of interesting. It has basically an auditory-like area in the precentral gyrus. So here's the theory update. The old theory is that Broca's area is coordinating all of the speech articulators from lips to larynx. The new theory is that there are two separable zones One, the dorsal one, controlling pitch, prosody, and song. That's the hypothesis, with pretty good evidence that it's controlling voice pitch from the intracranial work. And then this more ventral one is doing supralaryngeal speech coordination. That's the hypothesis. Okay. So a little bit of housekeeping. So I've been talking about these two zones using different studies, different populations, different methods, and so on. We did a little work to make sure we were talking about the same areas across these studies. So this is just showing auditory motor activation during syllable repetition and listening. And that's what's outlined here in the colors, showing the ROIs associated with that. So that would be kind of the location as identified with fMRI during speech listening and production tasks. And in colored, the colored patches here correspond to the stimulation mapping studies showing the speech arrest maximum probability region. And the point here, of course, is that these zones line up pretty nicely. So it does look like we're talking about the same region across these different studies. This is just looking at these same regions in relation to other maps. So these are the regions we're talking about. So I'm calling them the dorsal precentral speech area here in blue, the ventral precentral speech area. And when I say speech area, I just mean that it's speech responsive, not necessarily making any kind of claim about its specificity to speech. So certainly that's true of the dorsal one, which also is seems to respond to song, humming, and things like that. So here are these regions. The kind of colored zones in the back correspond to the different cytoarchitectonic zones based on the atlas. And the green zone corresponds to premotor cortex, Brodmann area 6. Primary areas are deeper in the sulcus, as you can see here. This is, we'll get to ventral laryngeomotor cortex in a minute. This is classical Broca's area, posterior part area 44, and you can see that the ventral speech area is not quite into Broca's area proper. So that's just showing a relational map. What I'm going to argue for is that these two speech areas on the precentral gyrus are part of separable and parallel hierarchies. So we're familiar with the ventral hierarchy, even if we don't necessarily understand all that's being done. In Broca's area, I think most would agree that there's some sort of a hierarchy where pars triangularis is doing something higher level for speech and language. The pars percularis, area 44, is doing something slightly lower level. The ventral precentral speech area in the precentral gyrus is doing some lower level speech coordination. And then you have orofacial motor cortex, which includes two different laryngeal motor cortex. We'll talk about that in a minute. The dorsal one is less familiar, and so this needs a little bit of motivation. So in terms of what it's doing. So I'm going to do that now. So we're going to start at the lowest level. So the basic, just to preview the basic idea, the dorsal precentral speech area is involved in pitch-related control during speech production. What it seems to be controlling at the level of primary motor cortex is the dorsal laryngeomotor cortex, which is living down in the sulcus here. I'll talk about that in the next slide. And then there's a higher level area that includes a region identified in Human Connectome Project-based parcellations, area 55B. And I'm going to argue that this is doing something higher level in speech language planning related to higher level aspects of prosody. So that's kind of where we're going with that. So let's start down at the bottom. Laryngeomotor cortex is something that researchers have been interested in mapping in the last decade or so, and with some success. And the interesting thing that's come out of this work is that there are two laryngeomotor cortices in humans. Interestingly, in non-human primates, there's only one. There's only this ventral one. But in humans, you can see clearly that there are two separable regions, one dorsal, one ventral. It is thought that the dorsal one is the region or is the laryngeomotor cortex that enabled humans, as opposed to non-human primates, to voluntarily control their larynx. So this seems to be something that's a more recent advance evolutionarily. We'll return to the evolution question shortly. Laryngeomotor cortex is fairly mapping onto fairly low levels. And again, just to show you this, if you define dorsal laryngeomotor cortex as was done, for example, in Kate Watkins' group where they controlled respiration, you get something that's quite deep in the sulcus and primary motor cortex, so kind of this zone. If you define it more broadly without controlling for respiration and so on, you get a broader region that stretches up into the precentral gyrus, and that's what this red outline is showing. But laryngeomotor cortex, the dorsal LMC proper, is deep in the sulcus here, not so much overlapping with the precentral speech area. This higher level area, area 55B, is a region that was identified early in the 20th century based on a myelin map. It was rediscovered in Human Connectome Project parcellation by Glasser. And you can see it here sitting between two eye fields, and it is distinguished by its differences in its myelination. So it's relatively unmyelinated, sitting just anterior to area 4, which is highly myelinated and surrounded by eye fields that are moderately myelinated. Task fMRI also delineates this region, and you can see this is a sentence listening task in the Human Connectome Project activating this region. So it's responding to higher level signals as well. Not surprising because we see activation in exactly this region during speech listening. It doesn't require sentences, but certainly activates to sentences. Here's another interesting thing, though. If you look at what this region seems to be related to, so this is a neurosynth-based meta-analysis on the term syntactic. You see some of the usual suspects, so parts of Broca's area, parts of Wernicke's area being implicated in syntax broadly defined. But you also see this more dorsal area, which is the more dorsal part of this area 55B. So you have a region in this zone, and this is kind of posterior middle frontal gyrus, that does seem to be doing something higher level in language planning. So that's interesting. It's also interesting that in other work that I'm involved in, looking at lesion correlates of aspects of syntax in a stroke population, we can see localization of agrammatism, agrammatic features in speech production in the frontal lobe as opposed to posterior areas, which show up as mapping onto paragrammatism. It's a little bit, we expected something in the frontal lobe for when we're mapping agrammatism, but it's a little more dorsal than we necessarily would have expected. You can see Broca's area down here, which does seem to have some involvement, but the center of mass is a little bit higher, which is interesting. It kind of maps onto this to some extent. So I don't think that this is the center for syntax processing in speech production. I think it is more related to prosody because of the more posterior area is more related to pitch control. And it might make sense that a prosodic deficit in speech planning could have syntactic reflection. So some psycholinguists argue that, to quote, the prosodic structure of an utterance provides the representational spine that governs the serial ordering of lexical elements and their subconstituents. So if prosodic frames are part of the planning frame for inserting morphosyntactic bits and pieces during speech planning, then you might expect to have some problems articulating speech at the syntactic level if you have a prosodic problem. So that's just kind of some evidence that this isn't such a super crazy idea. So we also looked at the connectivity of these dorsal and ventral precentral speech areas. Here's what the connectivity pattern looks like. This is a resting state data set. This is a task-based data set listening to speech, and this is fMRI and looking at functional connectivity. This is relative functional connectivity. So if you look in your own data set and poke into this area and look to see what's correlated with it, you'll see a whole bunch of stuff, including strong correlations between these regions, and vice versa. Same thing. If you just put a seed in this location, you'll see a lot of connectivity. You see these differences when you do relative connectivity. So which areas are more connected to the dorsal versus ventral areas? And this is the map that comes out. So again, kind of corroborating the connectome mapping study that I showed you earlier, the more ventral zone seems to be more connected to higher level somatosensory zones or inferior parietal region. The more dorsal zone seems to be connected to auditory regions more strongly. And that's true in both data sets. So to summarize what I've now started calling the dual speech coordination model, not to be confused with the dual stream model. We've got too many duals. This is kind of the picture. We have two separable hierarchies. Here's the dorsal and the ventral precentral speech area. One hierarchy in the dorsal zone is controlling the larynx via the dorsal laryngeomotor cortex. This is coordinating presumably aspects of pitch planning with respiration and such. And then this is doing something higher level, maybe lexical or phrasal prosody. That's the hypothesis. The ventral stream is the one we're familiar with. Um, this is the ventral precentral speech area. This is oral facial motor cortex, and then whatever is going on in Broca's area. Here's one idea. This zone, the ventral precentral speech area, is getting predominantly somatosensory input. The more dorsal speech area is getting more auditory input. So that's a summary of the model. So that's basically an outline of the model. Let me do a time check. I think we're doing good. So the next question is why two systems? So as I started looking at the evidence for these two different zones, I started wondering, why are they separate? What's going on here? And it turns out to make sense evolutionarily to have these two different systems. So that's kind of what I want to motivate here. So here's the basic frame of the argument. So pitch control is going to require some pitch-related auditory input, right? So anytime you have a motor planning problem from the brain's perspective, you need to have a sensory target for planning that whatever you're trying to produce or whatever action you're trying to generate. So if you're controlling pitch, if you have a system that's controlling voice pitch, it needs access to like feedback control of what pitches are actually being produced when you generate a pitch, so you can make sure that you're generating the right pitches. So it needs that auditory input. It makes sense then that you're getting these spectrotemporal receptive field maps that are sensitive to pitch in this region. Non-human primate ventral system controls orofacial gestures, but doesn't get the right kind of input. So this is kind of an argument for why we see pitch control more dorsally. So if you look in non-human primates, you see that the ventral region doesn't get auditory input so much. It's getting mostly somatosensory input. So then we can ask the question, what motor-related system does get the right kind of input in the pre-human primate brain? And it turns out that the region that is getting that right kind of input is the more dorsal orienting and attention system. So this is a map of dual streams of auditory projection in macaque monkey. This is auditory cortex, A1, belt regions, parabelt regions. There's an anterior and posterior divisions to these regions, higher level areas of auditory cortex. The anterior one tends to project prefrontally. The posterior one projects dorsally and a little bit more posterior. So the caudal auditory belt was mainly connected to the caudal principal sulcus as this zone and the frontal eye fields. Remember that the precentral speech area, as we've defined it, is sitting right in between two human eye fields. So this is making a little bit of sense. So let's talk for a minute about frontal eye fields and orienting. If you think about it, maybe not most, but a lot of studies who are interested in orienting and frontal eye field eye control study visual input. So you'll have a visual stimulus in the environment. The monkey or participant will be asked to saccade to that location and so on. But of course, we use auditory information for orienting too. You hear a sound off in the distance and you will orient to see what's going on. So that's obviously part of the frontal eye field system. We often think about orienting in auditory space in terms of orienting in the horizontal plane, where interaural level and time differences are the primary cue. But localizing information in vertical space can't rely on interaural differences because there are none. It's just right in the center. So they're hitting the ears at the same time and with the same amplitude. What we use instead there is spectral information. So not just time and level differences, but spectral information, including pitch-related features. So this is an argument that in the pre-human, the pre-speech brain, these regions were already getting the right kind of input to control pitch, that is spectral related information. Interestingly, pitch itself provides statistical cues to elevation. So on average, if you just go record the acoustic environment as you're walking through the forest, say, higher pitch sounds will tend to come from higher locations in space and lower pitch sounds from lower locations in space. Think like chirping birds versus a rumbling stream, that kind of thing. And so it's actually a useful environmental cue. And humans, in fact, if you hear a high-pitched sound, you will tend to orient more vertically. And if you hear a lower-pitched sound, you tend to orient um, more towards the ground. And this actually, if you do the experiments, people actually mislocate higher pitched sounds to slightly higher locations than they actually are. This is not a learned thing, it seems, because infants also do this, human infants, and dogs do it as well. So it's not something that's cultural necessarily. So there's something built in with respect to the connection between vertical height and pitch. The other important point is that the frontal eye field is not just an eye field. That's a misnomer. It's part of a more general orienting system. So here's the hypothesis that the dorsal precentral speech area evolved from a premotor orienting system. And the initial step in that evolution was in support of song. So some sort of song communication system in one of our ancestors. The ventral precentral speech area evolved later from oral facial control circuits. And there's a whole world of that kind of work by Peter McNeilage, the frame content theory. So the point is that this dorsal region was already pre-wired with the right kinds of inputs to enable speech pitch control for production. All right, so I'm going to review some of the evidence. So that's the hypothesis. I'm going to review some of the evidence that points in this direction. So dorsal but not ventral premotor areas receive auditory input, including spectral information in non-human primates. I made that point already. The dorsal precentral speech area, which is the posterior part of 55B, is sandwiched between two human eye fields in our brains, kind of making the case that it worked its way in there because it had the right response properties. Interestingly, vocal pitch and orienting is behaviorally yoked. So if I ask you whether Ariana Grande here is singing a high note or a low note, I haven't met anyone yet who thinks she's singing a low note. So it turns out that we tend to orient up. We raise our eyebrows, we orient our head, we gesture up when we're producing higher pitched sounds and more lower when we're producing lower pitched sounds. And if you record people singing or speaking, you can find these correlations with orienting responses correlated with pitch height of the vocalization in song, prosody, lexical tone. It shows up wherever you look. Pitch accents, of course, are also correlated with co-speech gesture. The accents align with gesture apex. The idea here is that gesturing is a kind of orienting response. It's kind of pointing to a location in some cases. So there's a connection there. So the idea is that this is a remnant of the evolutionary origin of vocal pitch control, the fact that our orienting responses tend to be correlated with pitch height during vocalization. I'm not going to go into it, but if you look at the literature on music processing in various studies, you can find a particular load on this dorsal region. So you can, just to summarize a whole bunch of work, if you just do a quick and dirty analysis on the term music in neurosynth, you get something that looks like this. Including this dorsal region, not so much in ventral zones, at this location. This is the dorsal precentral speech area coordinates from an fMRI study we did relatively recently, which lines up pretty well. So there's a connection between music processing generally and this dorsal precentral speech area. I'm not going to dwell on this because I want to leave plenty of time for questions, but the ventral zone is a more established story. The idea of the frame content theory is that the evolution of the ability to articulate speech arose out of oscillatory jaw movements. So think about chewing or lip smacking gestures in non-human primates. The idea is that this is a pre-adaptive frame for the evolution of phonetic content. So you have this open-close cycle of the jaw, and within that, in order to generate phonetic content, you can then, separately control your tongue, moving it to different positions and so on to get phonemes being produced. Yes, so in monkeys, these gestures, that is like lip smacking and so on, are coordinated by the ventral premotor cortex and there's little evidence for any kind of auditory input guiding those actions. It's more somatosensory, it kind of makes sense. So we have these two separable systems with different evolutionary histories, at least theoretically. That's the hypothesis with some evidence for that. The next question is, what order did they evolve? Which came first? The evidence points to the view that the dorsal one came first, like I said, the dorsal precentral speech area. I'm not talking about the ventral laryngeomotor cortex itself, which predates all of this stuff and exists in monkeys. But the higher level coordination areas seem to have evolved first with the dorsal one and then the ventral one. So the order of operations here is essentially in the early primate brain, there was a ventral oral facial control system that controlled things like mastication, oral grasping, lip smacking, things like that. Next came this dorsal laryngeal coordination system, the dorsal laryngeomotor cortex and the dorsal precentral speech area that coordinated it. And then after that came the ventral phonetic coordination system. So what's the evidence for this? There's 4 lines of evidence. One is that pitch control is computationally simpler. Specifically, it can be modeled by a simple linear system using only auditory feedback, whereas supralaryngeal control is much more complicated, multidimensional, nonlinear, requires somatosensory feedback, and so on. The idea here is that if you're going to evolve a speech control system, it's much easier to start with pitch control, which makes sense if prosody, for example, supports the planning of speech. And there's evidence, second point, that prosody does appear to support acquisition. Maybe that's due to prosodic planning frames, which could make the more complex phonetic control task more manageable in terms of its evolution and development. We also know that several species have evolved pitch control. This is songbirds, other animals that produce various kinds of song. Many species do this without supralaryngeal control. We don't see the reverse happening. So it seems like pitch is easy to evolve. Supralaryngeal control is harder. In development, pitch control in the form of cooing develops before phonetic control. So all of this points to the idea that the pitch system evolved first. Awesome. Timing is good. So this is not a new idea. Darwin argued that, or speculated that song was an early first step in language evolution. And this was, it's an idea that's been gaining some support in the literature in some form, which doesn't mean song in the sense of, full-blown music, but some sort of pitch-related communication system. Could have been something closer to emotional prosody, for example. And I think I will stop there and take some questions.
Amazing, thank you. I'm impressed how eloquent you are, given the early hour for you.
I'm glad I could hide my sleepiness.
Totally did not come across if you're sleepy. Thank you. I just want to remind people over on YouTube that now is the time to write your questions in the chat if you want me to bring them over and ask directly. And I'm also going to open with one question that's already there, which is about people with amusia or tone deafness. And the question is if they have a disruption to this pathway. Sorry, let me read this properly. What about people with amusia or tone deafness? Does it have a disruption of this pathway and lack of pitch note correction?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So these are some of the things that I'm interested in looking into for sure. If it is the case that this dorsal prosody pitch-related system is important for speech coordination and can disrupt language planning at higher levels, there should be some relation to music-like deficits, like amusia or aspects of amusia and speech production problems. There is some evidence that this is the case. But it's still early stages of research, so we don't know entirely. There's pretty decent evidence that rhythm, which is something that I've completely left out here, but I do have ideas about rhythm. Rhythm, of course, is an important part of prosody. It's an important part of music. And the idea here is that rhythm may be something that we evolved to coordinate these two separable systems, kind of like a conductor coordinating vocal production with supralaryngeal articulation. So yes, that should be the case, that there's some relation between music-related deficits and speech, and there's some evidence that it's the case, but lots more work to do on that front.
Amazing, thank you. Come back, here we go. Annie also has a question for you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Yeah, thanks a lot for the talk. Great overview, and yeah, very convincing when it comes to the two circuits you described. So in the first part of your talk, I was wondering if there's a way to also substantiate that with the white matter. So I know that what you've been describing is the cortical hubs, and yeah, it seems to be quite easy to distinguish these two. Very nice evidence for it. And do you think that subcortically we could do the same? So when it comes at some point to intraoperative mapping or whatever, that we would see this also, yeah, supported by different tracks? I know this is not necessarily what you're investigating, but if there's evidence for yeah, supporting this.
No, I think it's a good question. And so, I mean, we kind of addressed that at least with respect to speech, in that connecto mapping study that I talked about, that identified two separable white matter connection pathways essentially involved in speech repetition. Could we extend that and look at, change the task and have people humming back melodies, like melody repetition or song repetition? We've actually started doing that study in stroke and got some preliminary work. We haven't looked at DTI or white matter connections yet, but yes, I would expect exactly the same sort of thing to come out. Stronger connections to that dorsal zone with auditory areas, and stronger connections to the ventral zone with somatosensory related systems in the posterior parietal lobe. So yes, I think it could be done, should be done. Definitely worth looking at.
Thank you.
I also have a couple of questions. Sorry, here we go. I also have a couple of questions for you. So when you presented your dorsal zone region, that is neatly sitting in between the frontal, the eye fields. I was wondering if location-wise, if area 55B basically is a match with Exner's area that has been implicated for reading and writing. So I was wondering where you see that anatomically, functionally, and conceptually integrated into this work.
Yeah, I've looked into that a little bit. Of course, Exner's area, for those of you who aren't familiar with this, was supposed to be the reading, writing specifically area that was the writing analog to Broca's area. So Exner did back in a couple centuries ago. And then people didn't look at it for a long time. I looked briefly at what's the literature, and my read of the literature is that Exner's area, properly defined, is a little bit more dorsal. So a little kind of in that same zone, but more dorsal to what the regions that we're talking about. So which would make sense, because as you go from dorsal laryngeomotor cortex in M1, you go up, you get to the hand area. So if there's some writing coordination system, it might make sense that it's a little bit more dorsal than what we're talking about. But I think in order to answer those kinds of questions in a tight functional anatomic space, some within subject experiments need to be done, so we can not just look at average locations associated with these different functions in different groups of people.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. And also looking at the literature, the definition of Exner's area is, as you say, it's not entirely clear. So it's roughly located somewhere between the inferior frontal gyrus and the frontal eye field, at the intersection of the middle frontal gyrus and the precentral gyrus. So somewhere there, but no clear anatomical or functional boundaries. that are consistent in the literature.
Yeah, I think if you looked at the literature, I think you could, depending on what you wanted to see, if you wanted to find evidence that Exner's area is the same zone I'm talking about, you could probably convince yourself that's true. I'm skeptical though. We just don't have the functional anatomic precision to answer that question yet. I suspect it's a little bit more dorsal though, not exactly the same area.
I like the yet. It's to come. I have to, oh, sorry. I'll hand over to, I think Sabrina was first.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. Really interesting. Well, at some point I saw that you was presenting a picture image with also morphosyntactic processing aspects. So I was just wondering which white matter or tracts are you thinking are really associated to this aspect? And also I saw from temporal to frontal regions, and in particular I was thinking also to the specific part of triangularis and opercularis part that's you were showing also before.
Yeah, so I should be really clear when I draw those swooping arrows from on the big summary image. Those arrows are not intended to be anatomical pathways at all. So I just had to put them in where I could fit them so you could see them. Yeah, so I'm not a particular expert on white matter pathways, so you all who are could help educate me. But my kind of guess is that the ventral precentral speech area, the relevant white matter connection is something part of the SLF, a more surface white matter area. SLF3 is it that's more kind of in that zone? Someone correct me, ish. In any case, kind of that the higher level one is maybe portions of the arcuate fasciculus connecting kind of middle temporal gyrus with more anterior ventral regions like the pars triangularis or pars opercularis. But yeah, I haven't dug into the white matter connectivity patterns of these deeply yet. So maybe you all could help me. I know some of you are much more into this than I am.
Okay, thank you.
So I think you're right. Some SLF connectivity, some arcuate connectivity. I was also wondering about the fronto-aslan tract, if that would nicely connect them ventrodorsal in a more direct way rather than to posterior parts of the brain.
Like connectivity between these speech areas to the aslant tract and then from like SMA to
yeah, so basically the route between IFG and SMA that you can just go inferior superior direction rather than these areas connecting via the association pathways to more posterior parts of the brain.
Yeah, surely, I mean, given that brains are highly connected, I wouldn't be surprised if there are multiple pathways for connecting these different areas. And certainly we see that with functional connectivity. Like I said, if you just put a seed in either of these areas and look at functional connectivity, it's the language network that it's connected to broadly. But it's the relative connection strengths that were more interesting to me. But yeah, I think, I mean, even when you look at the cortical stimulation mapping of speech arrest, you see SMA, you see ventral zone, you see the dorsal zone, you see posterior areas. So that's kind of the lower level coordination network. And I'm sure there's interconnectivity between those nodes in multiple different ways.
Everything is connected to everything.
Yeah, I know I'm not very helpful to answer, but yeah.
I'm going to take one question from YouTube again. Do you think that there could be a high-level audiovisual gradient in the frontal cortex, similar to what seems to exist in the temporal lobe at a more lower level?
Audiovisual gradient. Some gradient between visual and auditory perception systems. I'm not sure I understand the question entirely.
I would assume so, but that's all I can give you for the time being.
Yeah.
That person
So
wants to
certainly,
specify as you answer.
Yeah, so if we're talking about audiovisual gradients in the posterior zone, one way to think about that is the gradient between kind of biological motion related areas in the posterior superior temporal sulcus, or that respond to like visual speech, and then you have regions in auditory cortex that are mostly auditory, and then more lateral STS is kind of doing both audio visual processing. So maybe that's the kind of gradient that's being referred to here. Is there something like that in frontal areas? I want to say not so much. I mean, that's my off the cuff kind of thought about what's the reflection in the frontal lobe between those things. Certainly, there are different input pathways that are going to be important for guiding speech. I don't know that visual is going to be all that important for speech planning, but that's just my kind of shoot from the hip kind of thought.
Great, thank you. Lilith has been patiently waiting, so I'm going to give the floor to you.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for the talk. It was really interesting. I have one comment concerning the frontal ascending tract. Actually can be also true because there are direct electrical stimulation intraoperative that show also speech arrest, so can be additional support towards this idea. And the question, a bit more general about what do you think about language as a bilateral function, and is this also dorsal part also bilateral, or is it only left hemisphere dominant?
Yes.
This question.
Yeah, good question. I always get asked about lateralization patterns because everyone cares about that. I admittedly don't care that much about lateralization patterns, but maybe it's an unpopular position. But my general view, so I will answer your question directly in a second, but I'll just give you my philosophy on these kinds of questions and these ideas. In general, I think that there is much more to learn. Like if we want to explain the most variance in language neuroanatomy, we're going to be looking at within hemisphere architecture and not left-right architecture. I think there's a little bit of variance to explain, some more in some aspects of language, some less in the lateralization pattern. But I think most of the progress in mapping the neuroanatomy of language is just simply in the within hemisphere organization. So I focus on that and don't pay much attention to the dominance patterns generally, which is why I don't mention it much in my talks. That said, I do think that in general, the lateralization potential in the organization of these systems is, if we were going to identify a principle, the closer you are to the periphery on the motor or sensory side, the more bilateral it's going to be. The higher level you go, the more the potential there is for a lateralization pattern. So if we're talking about something like syntax, very high level, then I think there's a potential for left dominance. Once we get down on the production side to pitch control, I think that's more bilateral, and that seems to be what the evidence suggests. Certainly at the lowest levels, it's quite bilateral. So it's just an empirical question, and if I had to answer it directly, I think the dorsal precentral speech area is largely bilateral. There may be some functional differences between what the two sides are doing exactly. Hypotheses might be emotional versus linguistic prosody kinds of differences, but I think that's, it's an empirical question that hasn't been studied deeply. Some evidence for emotional prosody being localized more to the right than the left.
Okay.
Yeah. Does that help?
Thank you so much. Yeah, no, it was interesting to listen your opinion. Yeah, thank you.
Well, if I can follow up on that question, if we're just asking you for your definitions and opinions, then my question to you would be so you briefly mentioned it at the beginning of the talk somewhere, Broca's area, and you had various pictures that kind of indicated what you mean with Broca area, but you never spelt it out. So the question is, what is Broca area anatomically to you?
So what's Broca's area doing, or what is it anatomically?
I take both. If you can get an answer to both, even better.
I kind of subscribe to the standard definition. I think it's standard that Broca's area includes the pars opercularis and the pars triangularis. That's the classic Broca's area in my mind. I also believe that it's multifunctional, that there isn't a function of Broca's area. There are probably multiple subfunctions. If I had to guess, I mean, my guess is essentially what I wrote on that summary picture, that the posterior, that Broca's area is part of a hierarchy that includes at least 2 levels of planning and production. I think it's more production related. One is lower level kind of syllable level sequencing. There's some evidence for that in the functional imaging literature, whereas the pars triangularis, the higher level function, is something to do with maybe morphosyntactic planning for production. So that's my best guess, but I still don't think we understand Broca's area yet.
I would agree with that. Now, still on your broader perspective, including your own work. So if we take the dual stream model, then we have 2 routes of language processing in the brain. Now you're giving us 2 routes for speech processing in the brain. How does that all integrate and work together?
Yeah, so the dual stream model, it's kind of misunderstood, I would say. People, when it was developed, we developed it from the perspective of speech perception. So when the first paper we wrote that ended up being the dual stream model was a straight up speech perception. What areas are involved in speech perception? And there was no dual streams. It was like an argument that the superior temporal gyrus bilaterally was the neural substrate for perceiving speech under normal conditions, right? So that was the claim. And then a reviewer came back and said, well, what about the fact that when you damage anywhere in the left hemisphere, including frontal areas, you can get speech perception deficits as defined by syllable discrimination. So ba, pa, same, different. And that was true. So most of our argument was based on speech perception as defined by what you're doing naturally right now, listening to speech and comprehending, not deciding whether one syllable in a sentence is the same as another syllable in my same sentence. You're not even hearing syllables, you're hearing words. So, so that forced us to try to explain this anomaly that you got these syllable discrimination-based deficits with unilateral left hemisphere lesions. And what we ended up tying it to was, or just notice the correlation between deficits on that task and working memory problems, which had the same neuroanatomy. And of course, working memory involves articulatory rehearsal, and that would implicate frontal lobe. So that's how we explained it. And it kind of explained away that set of data that we weren't particularly interested in. And it was confounding our interpretation. So the dual stream model was basically saying that from the perspective of the auditory system, as you listen to speech, there's 2 kinds of mappings you can perform. One is the normal mapping when you're listening to speech, which is comprehending, and that's ventral. The other is you can remap those sounds onto your motor articulatory system and reproduce that speech, which would be useful if it's a working memory task or something like that, or a repetition task. Then you're going to use this dorsal network. So it was entirely auditory driven kind of thinking. What do auditory speech representations need to map onto? And then you have this dual stream split. But if we're talking about regular old normal speech, like we're doing now, I'm speaking, that's involving the entire language system. I'm activating posterior temporal areas to activate morphosyntactic plans, activate lemmas, mapping that onto phonological representations in the superior temporal lobe, and mapping that onto motor structures for planning sentences and so on. So it's the entire network, including what we call dorsal and ventral zones, right? So this is really, so if we just back up and look at speech organization in general, production involves the entire network. But what I've argued today is that that planning process splits into 2 substreams, which is this dorsal and ventral frontal areas, these 2 speech coordination streams. So yes, it's a little bit confusing, and I was kind of a bit hesitant to talk about another dual stream thing in the context of other dual stream models, but I think eventually we'll get it all sorted out and understand it clearly, especially if we think about the dual stream model as something that applies to the organization of the system from the viewpoint of the auditory system. It's a different viewpoint of the whole thing. Hope that clarified rather than confused.
It does. Here we go. Sorry.
You didn't need to talk to keep it focused on you.
Yeah. It's looking for you all the time.
Uh-huh.
No, it does. And I think it is brave to introduce another dual stream. But we can handle it over time, I guess. Right. I saw that your answer actually already answered one of the questions on YouTube that was retracted since. And I don't see any questions at the moment, and we're also out of time. So thank you so much for joining us today and opening the 2024 season of CNS Talks for us. For everyone who's interested to join us next month, we're going to have a talk about Parkinson's disease and its impact on speech. So we nicely follow up from this talk, moving into a clinical talk next month. So do join us for that, the last Wednesday of the month at 4 p.m. And thank you all for being here. Thank you, Greg, for your talk, and have an exciting time until next time. Bye.